Hello, and welcome to the Red Bank Humanists podcast. Each month, Red Bank Humanists hosts a public forum featuring speakers and topics covering a wide range of subjects of special interest to the humanist community. To learn more, including information about our monthly book club and our Drinking Post-Theologically events, visit redbankhumanists.org and follow us on Twitter at Red Bank Humanists.
It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my longtime former colleague, Sherry West, from Brookdale Community College. I just want to say briefly how Sherry and I got to know each other. We have to thank the gas crisis of the mid-'70s when Brookdale arranged for people who lived in the same area to carpool to come to work. And Sherry and I both lived in the Brick area, and we bonded. And it was just wonderful to meet her. And so I just want to give you a little bit of her background. She got her BA from William and Mary, her MA from Montclair, and she did graduate work at Rutgers and the University of Maryland. Sherry and I both started out at Brookdale as what was called paraprofessionals, which means we worked to assist the departments. And we rose dramatically during the years that we were there, and both ended up professors in our own area. Sherry is very distinguished. She has co-written the textbook, I believe it was, for the course that they taught, wrote the curriculum for many of the programs, and has done a great deal of travel. Sherry's talk is on women today, and actually, way back in the 70s, we kind of began one of the first consciousness-raising women's groups at Brookdale, and so our consciousness is completely raised at this point. And Sherry will, tell you more about her travels and her life as she gives her program. I'm delighted to introduce Sherry West.
Thanks, Irma. Okay, so today what I want to do is to focus on the role of women in the world, but happy Mother's Day to all of you who are mothers or who have mothers or who had mothers, and I guess that probably includes all of us. I think this is a nice little way to start the show, but I actually prefer this next slide as perhaps a more meaningful and realistic tribute that we might want to give to mothers. I know I'll drink to that. And I hope you have an occasion to celebrate today in some way or another. I'm toasting not only to Mother's Day, but also to this next woman, my friend, Gloria Steinem, who came to Brookdale a couple of years ago. Toasting to her because she's been an inspiration to me. She is what is often associated with the second wave of feminism, the women's movement that changed many women's lives from then until today, that started in the 60s. And since the talk is titled A Personal Journey, what I want to do is to use myself as an example of how things for women changed in the United States. And then I'm also, and by way of doing that, not only going to share with you some of Gloria Steinem's ideas, but also one of her presumed successors, Sheryl Sandberg, who's caused quite a stir with her recent book. Anybody read it? Lean In is the name of the book. Lean In. Well, I'll share with you some of her ideas. At first, I wasn't going to read it. I thought, meh, because it received a great deal of criticism. As I noted, you probably can't see this very well, but on the cover of Time magazine, when I was coming back from the bathroom a few minutes ago, it says this: don't hate her because she's successful. And certainly that's one of her key arguments. Women have to lean in, they have to speak up, and that they have to be more assertive if they're not blinded by the light, so to speak. But I'm also going to talk about the role of women in the world. And maybe this is a little bit of a cheap shot because I already had these slides. And this is an extreme case, but probably most of you are familiar with this picture, right?
Yes.
The Afghan girl, taken in 1985. Sharbat Gula is her name. Well, the National Geographic people, again, in 2003. And I'm going to share with you her story because her story, while perhaps somewhat extreme, nevertheless is not unrepresentative of women's lives in much of the rest of the world. And so I'm going to share her story with you, as well as to talk eventually about the Arab Spring. So these are the 4 questions, as you see on the program sheet, that I'm going to be dealing with today. How do the lives of women compare with their counterparts around the world? What are the most pressing issues for women? Can women have it all? Sheryl Sandberg's book has sort of reignited this whole question about what should women's roles be in society. Can women have both a life and work and motherhood? All of these questions I'm going to sort of touch on, and I would like to make you part of the conversation as I move through the slides by asking you questions as well. Finally, focusing in on the ways in which women's lives have been changed as a result of the Arab Spring. So it's perhaps a challenging set of questions to deal with. I do have a fairly long slideshow, so let's get going. And I want to, according to this Pew poll, it's been suggested, and I don't know how well you can see any of these graphics, but the question is, who has the better life? The typical response of many in the world, at least of the 35 plus countries that were surveyed, is that men around the, in different countries around the world, this isn't exclusively European or what have you, believe that men still have the better life. Some say, no, they're probably the same, and curiously, down at the bottom of the list, Japan and Korea, there is a greater preference for people to answer the question that women have better lives. I suspect that might have something to do with the workday of the sarariman, as they say in Japan, but I'm not sure about that. What do you think? Do you think men have a better life? That it's still a man's world? And why? Huh? Because women let them. That would be Sheryl Sandberg's argument. That we need to lean in and we need to take control in various ways. Yes?
We make the yardstick to measure the quality.
We make the yardstick. Men make set the goals, okay? And that is because, anybody disagree with that? So men are still dominant in the society, or they still dominate in terms of their ability to direct, control, legislate, assess, evaluate, whatever term you want to use. General agreement there? Are there any other reasons that you think men have a better life? Do they live longer? No. So they pay a price, perhaps, for that degree of domination. Are they happier? That's a fuzzier thing to kind of wrap your head around. Yes?
As long as men brutalize women, get away with it, it's always going to be that way. My wife used to have to say, if she was as a woman, she ought to hate men, but she doesn't.
And she would hate men because of their brutalization, because of the violence. And unfortunately, all too recently, we've had all too many examples of that kind of brutalization. Yes? Machismo has become a virtue. Agree with that? So this is kind of doomy and gloomy. And I used to teach. In fact, I wanted to thank recognize a couple of my former students who are here, who remind me of a term that used to be used to refer to me and my colleague, Tony Snyder, that we were the doom and gloom twins, because we could always bring down an audience with whatever particular topic, particularly in the contemporary history topic. But I have to say that while I agree with all of those things, I also want to just take it one level deeper, since I am an educator. My husband said, this is too much like a lecture, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this. But if I had to answer that question why, well, I do have to, and I'm going to. These are the 4 things that I would use. I call them the 4 Ps, and maybe there's a 5th one, but we'll leave that one out for now. Patriarchy, which is nothing other than what some of you have already said, the yardstick by which everything is measured. Patriarchy did not exist in the earliest societies of human beings, but as civilization evolves, it's going to co-evolve. And from patriarchy, of course, comes power, a set of power relationships that lead to male domination, and this has been true in every society from the beginning of civilizations. That patriarchy has led to the dominance and the ability of men to control women, and women have been subordinate, in many cases, physically segregated, or in other ways made to understand and to acknowledge and to accept that power relationship. Perception is another one that I think is important for us to grapple with, and that flows, of course, from the power relationships. Men are considered, as was noted in that earlier survey, better than women, and that has to do with the role that gender plays from almost the very beginning of our lives. I wanted to show you a little video clip, but you've probably already seen an example of little boys and girls being asked different questions. Are you a girl or a boy? 3 years old. Oh, I'm a boy. What makes you a boy? Oh, I do boy things. Well, what kinds of boy things? Oh, well, I play with trucks and so forth. Now that I have grandchildren, I can see this, even though my granddaughter's only 5 months old. I can see already the pink, the pink, the pink. The going into the gymboree and, let's see, daddy, smart like daddy, pretty like mommy on the t-shirts. So that, you know, from a very early age, we learn. We are made socially aware of or socialized into certain roles in the society. This is true for other things other than gender, but perception is very important because it also demonstrates preference and also makes it much more difficult to change some of those ideas. That's, again, what Sheryl Sandberg is speaking to in her book, Lean In. She argues that we women have to internalize the revolution or reignite it by understanding the fear that we face, the reluctance to not be considered to be so nice and to speak out. And finally, from a global perspective, frankly, even in the United States, one of the most insidious reasons for the gender inequality and the differences that exist have to do with poverty. When 80% of the people in the world live on less than $10 a day, in a society that is flush with wealth, something's wrong. And so poverty is another one of those critical, I think, again, institutional or basic factors that help to explain some of the gender imbalances. Well, now let's get to my story, or rather the story of women. What do you think are the most important factors that influence a woman's life? Childbearing, okay? Career choices. Any others? Yeah? The family that she's born into. Self-image, and how that comes to be formed. Where you live in terms of the, I don't know, what would you say, not the demographic, but the physical work. Yeah, if you live in a rural area, you're going to have a different situation perhaps than in urban areas or in suburban communities. Globally, it's what kind of a law system, what kind of a government that you would experience or be born into. Yeah. What about religion and the role that religion has played? And I skipped church to be here today. Sorry about that, but I figured that she'd understand. So these are some of the things that I've come up with. Of course, some of the things you've already said. Some of these are overlapping. Certainly, the parents that you're born to are also can provide you with a measure of security, economic security, as well as social status. Race, I think, plays an important role, as does one's ethnicity, particularly in many of these societies where both religion and culture still seem to exert a great deal of influence, such as in the case of Sharbat, the Afghan woman, and many others that are trying to protest as a result of the Arab Spring. For me, now I'm going to start on my own personal journey, as the title of the talk suggests, by using myself as an example of the changes that have taken place in some of the critical stages in my own life, birth, youth, etc. For me, where I was born, in Hampton, Virginia, in 1945, but in the United States, which had a democratic government, and the fact that I was white, even if Italian and Catholic, which made me a little bit of an outsider. And most importantly, I think for me, the education that I was able to get are the three most important things for me. And probably each one of you would answer somewhat differently. But for me, now moving into my own story, with, yes, pictures from my own life. They haven't been doctored, although there was a smudge on my cheek that my husband fixed. So be it. So I guess self-image does still play a role in some way. As I said, I was born in 1945 in Hampton, Virginia. I was born in a hospital, so I had access to medical care. My parents, I was born to two parents, one of whom, as I've mentioned before, was an Italian who immigrated to this country when he was 2. I mean, he came as an infant himself. But I had an Italian surname, Carpini, and I was raised Catholic. And so even there in Protestant, Hampton, Virginia was undergoing, it was more like a suburb, suburban life. When I was born in 1945, just after the war ended, World War II ended. So that I was a little bit of an outcast in this otherwise Protestant land of Smiths, Jones, and Browns. And that was going to play somewhat of a role in my upbringing, particularly because we tended to move to the more rural part of Hampton. And as a result, I interacted more with the Smiths, Jones, and the Southern Baptists than I did with many people who were Catholic, having just gone to school there. But if I had been a woman at that time, women's lives were extremely restricted in 1945. I couldn't attend school with blacks because Virginia was legally segregated. These were all legal prohibitions that are going to change dramatically in the wake of the 1960s and along with the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and other things, as you're well aware. I couldn't marry anyone that was non-Caucasian. And some of these laws, by the way, wouldn't be changed until relatively recently and need Supreme Court authorization, you know, a number of Supreme Court cases. I could not attend some state colleges in my own state that my parents paid taxes for, could not. I couldn't even serve on a jury until the 1960s. Women, I should say women, because I was too young to do any of that, couldn't technically legally vote. I know this is a technicality, but I just wanted to use that as an example of the kinds of, as you've mentioned, legal restrictions on women. And these restrictions or control would follow me much of my early life, although in childhood, I had a good life. I would call it a happy and healthy childhood. I could go to school which about 60% of the women in the world cannot do. The Charbot has never gone to school, although she can write her name. We did go to Catholic school for 4 years. It was a good education. But then my parents had, surprise, surprise, twins. So their financial situation changed. And we convinced them or encouraged them to let us go to public schools, for which I'm ever grateful. And we moved to a larger home, again in the suburbs. And we I had what I would call a normal family life. Not wealthy, not impoverished, but somewhere, you know, in the middle, like many striving individuals. During this time, this was the golden era of communities, of people in America. And my biggest fears, as I say, there were probably communism and polio. And science would come to the rescue with the polio vaccine by the time I was 10 or 11. And so I was spared even that adversity. It was education, as I've already pointed out to you, that I think has made the biggest difference to me in my own life. I graduated from high school in 1963, so I'll be celebrating my 50th high school reunion this coming October. And then I went on to William and Mary. When I was meeting with my counselor in high school, I said, so what do you think about my college choices? I had to go to an in-state school. My parents couldn't afford to send me out of state. But they wanted me to go to school. That's the important thing. Although my father, on occasion, was known to say, look, if we can only afford school for you or your brother's going to school. So even though he was educated, he realized the existing restrictions that existed for women, which were considerable in terms of their career choices. I mean, why did you go to school? You went to school to get married, to find a suitable husband. And that's still around. If you've heard recently the Princeton mother, who wrote that's what young women at Princeton should be doing. So my high school counselor said to me about William and Mary, don't go there, you'll never fit in. And I couldn't understand it because my grades were good enough. And I think it probably was a result of his bias, not so much against women in this case, but probably because my last name was Carpini. I'll never know. I was shocked. I went there anyway. I decided, oh yeah, you don't think I'm going to fit in? I'm going to fit in. I became the president of my college sorority, which I know doesn't sound very revolutionary, but at the time was, to me, a way that women could become a leader, at least exercise some degree of leadership. We didn't have any organized sports. This was before Title IX. I also never, until my senior year of college, attended school with anyone who was black. And but that's all going to begin to change. Let me ask you, do you remember the 60s? Or do you remember, I know that's probably a silly question to ask, do you remember one of the things that changed the most for you as a result of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War and the protests that were engendered, the youth movements, and the women's movement, which of course brought Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and many others, consciousness raising eventually by the early 70s into power. Anybody remember it or want to comment?
I did
just
all
skip.
of that. What changed me was Woodstock. I said, where am I? Where have I been? And then I saw what was happening with the change in the youth. And I changed.
And you changed for the better.
I think.
Yeah, okay, all right, good. Anybody else? Any other personal experiences you want to share? Yes.
I worked at Roche Pharmaceuticals in the early 70s, and there was a lawsuit against their treatment of women. And so everyone was offered a seminar that went on for 3 days about women's place in the workplace and how, as you're even talking about now, women needed to be more assertive and band together and not be in competition. And that was a big change.
Okay, so attending, in a sense, kind of a consciousness raising or an awareness session Anybody else want to comment? Yeah.
In 1978, when I was a college student, I had a summer job working for the National Women's Political Caucus.
Oh.
We were raising money that would help support candidates in states where they were hoping to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified. And so I was going door to door, which is a very, very hard job.
Yes. Yeah, I know from my own dreary political experience it is. But what a laudable thing to do. Unfortunately, the ERA would come three states short of its being ratified. A lot of things would change in a negative way in the 1970s. And I'll mention that perhaps in a minute. But there was great promise. And even though I had not been able to play any sports, although my freshman field hockey coach approached me one day, she was just my gym teacher. She had to take gym, and she said, you're good. You should go out for the team. And I thought to myself, I want to be a Southern Belle. I can't go running up and down a field. What are people going to think about me? Stupid. Because I would have had the company of other women. I would have been able to travel. I'd hardly been outside Virginia at the time. Things were really quite restrictive for women. Still, job ads listed help wanted for men, help wanted for women. And there was still that serious racial divide that still exists in many cases. But that education that I got gave me a ticket into the middle class. And that's why I think if there's one thing that you could take away from this program, whether it be for women in the United States or women in the most impoverished parts of the world, it is the value that education plays. Education, certainly, all the cliches, open my horizons and that sort of thing. But it also enabled me to have opportunities that I would not have otherwise. I did marry someone that I met at college who lived in New Jersey, and that's why I eventually made my way here. I did teach high school for 5 years before I started at Brookdale, as Irma's mentioned to you. I taught when my first husband decided to go back to law school, we went to Richmond, Virginia, moved to Richmond, and I taught in a school that was under court-ordered desegregation for 3 years. The racial balance went from 70% white-black to 70% black-white during that 3 years. So it was a testing and challenging time, but it was also a time of tremendous opportunity. But boy, did I strike it lucky, I feel, when I went to Brookdale. Even as a lowly paraprofessional, as Irma mentions. I then subsequently, in 1974, when I got my master's degree, was able to be hired as a full-time instructor. And the joy of working in an institution that gave you the kinds of things that I think probably very few people in the workforce have today. I know after reading Sheryl Sandberg's book and talking with some of my friends who worked in business, and maybe some of you who have can comment, the ability to have a flexible schedule, the ability to be able to innovate, think of new courses. I co-taught with one of Freda's dear friend, one of Irma's dear friends, Freda Hepner, a peace studies course. I taught the U.S. in the nuclear age, which led me to, which enabled me to I went to a conference and met my second husband. The ability to earn a good living and to be able to therefore pay for the child care that was promised in the 1970s. Do you realize that both the House and the Senate in 1971 passed federally subsidized child care, daycare, early education programs? It was sent to President Nixon for his signature, and he vetoed it. And the issue has barely been raised since. In fact, if anything, there have been cuts to all kinds of education from preschool on up as a result of this sequestration. When it's very clear that in the work world, women and men, families need more help than ever. 60% of women work with children under the ages of 5. So we're talking about a real crisis in a sense. And childcare is extraordinarily expensive, as probably many of you know, or probably many of you are doing some of that duty. I know when I go out to California, my son even made a granny cave for me in his basement, so that when I can visit him, because they live there, I can help him out with things. So despite my good fortune at working at Brookdale, despite being able to do something that my father encouraged me not to do, Sherry, never talk politics or religion. I've done that almost all of my adult life in my capacity as a teacher of World Civ and Middle Eastern history and other things. Despite all of that, I still don't make as much as many of my Brookdale colleagues, and it's been recently estimated that over the course of a 40-year working life, a woman stands to be in deficit by almost $500,000, by $500,000, because of a variety of reasons I don't have time to go into now. So income inequality still exists. It still exists, by the way, in terms of, in the business world, the glass ceiling, which I'll talk about when I talk about some of Sandberg's ideas. So I married for the first time pretty conventionally right out of college. I was engaged by the time I graduated from college. I married in the summer of that year and went to New Jersey. But I subsequently grew, like Betty Friedan said, very dissatisfied with my life, even though I had what looked like a picture-perfect life, a lawyer husband, 2 kids. I still was, and a great job in my case. I still was dissatisfied, and so I divorced and eventually would marry a second time, and this is a picture of us at our second marriage, at my second marriage, with my son who has morphed into Brian, and his wife, Ginger, Brian works for a video game company. Ginger works as a nurse at the VA hospital. And so they are a dual breadwinning family. My son, Dan, who was adopted at the age of 5 months from Korea. Kind of unusual because many adoptions today, and even during that time, were adoptions that involve women, but Holt, the agency we used, had just opened their adoption process. Korea was mad at us, so they weren't letting anybody to adopt. So I think that's the reason that we were able to adopt Danny. He works as a deli clerk at a Safeway out in California. But in terms of gender, the overwhelming number of kids who are adopted are and continue to be girls. Anybody have adopted members of your families? Yeah? Uh-huh. From? Korea? 2 brothers from Korea. And what were their ages?
7 and 9.
7 and 9. Okay, so they were a little bit older. I thought we were going to get a baby girl because they typically tend to place someone of the opposite sex if you already have a biological child of one sex. It didn't happen, and I didn't care. I took him, and sometimes I've lived to regret it maybe, but haven't we all? That's why we need to drink today sometime or other. I have always been involved in politics from, I don't know, early on. And I decided that rather than just help to support other people, I would run for political office. Now, maybe the people that I hung out with left a little bit to be desired. Here I am with Bob Torricelli, and then John Corzine, and 2 of my 3 runs for office in Wall Township, New Jersey. I'm a 3-time loser, however. Democrats are few and far between in that area, but I also served as the Kerry and Obama campaigns, although I did start out to support Hillary Clinton, and I certainly hope that there will be a way, as is noted in this next slide. I don't know if you know of Emily's list, but Madam President campaign is urging the election of a woman president in 2016, although I guess the House Foreign Relations Committee is doing their best to put that to a stop. But 90% of Americans would vote for a woman president. Still in all, The good news is that since 1970, the number of women in political office has grown. Almost all countries, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, allow women to vote at least, even if their voting is restricted and controlled. But then in a lot of countries that aren't democratic, that's true of just about everyone. It's not exclusive necessarily to women. We, however, could do more to bring women into leadership positions, which is another of Sheryl Sandberg's concerns. In fact, she argues that when she asked the Liberian Nobel Prize winner in 2011 what was the one thing that she thought would help women and the world more than any other, she said, women, have more women in power. And Sandberg extends that to not just political power, but also in business. And this is one of my more recent forays into when I went to the Sanity rally. So I was about to become a grandmother. And this sane, that is, grandma-to-be, back in 2010, is voting D. So from time to time, and I have my little Gandhi shirt, keep walking, on. So I've tried to walk the walk. I've stepped back a little bit because now I've become a grandmother. And you know, grandmothers were the original laptops. I do like that shirt. Of an adorable 2.5-year-old grandson who likes rocket ships, but also likes his daddy to fix it, and runs to his daddy to ask him to fix it. I said, I can fix it, I can fix it. I can't fix it, but I'm going to pretend I can fix it. And my equally adorable 5-month granddaughter, Vivi, Danny and Vivi. And then I've also retired. So as I am moving into retirement phase, it's important, I think, for me not only to give back for them and for their future, but also to help women who don't have those choices. And I'll tell you what I do on a personal basis a little bit later on. So that's my story. Nothing exceptional. That's what my husband said. Why are you even going to bother with this? Well, I originally was going to alternate me and this person, but I married him for his frequent flyer miles. And so let me just whisk through these because I know I'm running out of time and I want to address women in the world and I want to talk about the Arab Spring. In 2011, I accompanied him on a trip to Saudi Arabia. And I was invited. You don't have tourist visas in Saudi Arabia. And here we are with my friend Tanya, who's Russian, but she and her husband live in Saudi Arabia, and he works at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology near Jeddah, which is on the Red Sea. And I was invited to give a talk on the role of women, just like today. And I was in the process of preparing my talk when I got this email from Tanya's husband saying, you can't go. We think it would not be a good idea for you to give your talk. I wondered when I was originally asked, you really want me to talk about the role of women anywhere? But he said yes. And then the Arab Spring started to happen. In fact, the week that we were there, spring break of 2011, the Saudi army went into Bahrain to try to help them suppress a protest that was breaking out there. We landed on what was supposed to be the day of rage in Saudi Arabia, but it fizzled out. In any event, here I am in my abaya, and I brought it, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to bother. So we land in Saudi Arabia, and this is the entry card, warning for death trafficker. On the plane, before you land, women, Western women as well, have to don the abaya. I can get away without the headdress, and I didn't wear it for some of the time that I was in at KAUST, King Abdullah University. It's a beautiful place. Our oil dollars at work, I might add. But here are some shots. They're not the best, but you see the mix of old and new, a guy on a Segway, speaking with a woman who's smoking a cigarette in an abaya. At the university, you don't need to cover. And it is completely and totally like any university, almost anywhere else around, in the Western world at least. I was able to meet, when they canceled my talk, they said, we got to figure out something to justify her coming here. So I met with 2 American women from prestigious graduates of prestigious universities who had been invited to, who were studying there. They got gobs of money to study there. I asked them, why did you do that? Isn't it very restrictive? Oh man, we got a travel budget you wouldn't believe. And they were able to study with some pretty internationally known, renowned people like my husband's friend, the guy who heads up the museum, and the wife of a Nobel Prize winner who was in town. They also set me up to meet a couple of, one Saudi woman who had studied at George Washington University. This is our friends. This is my husband, Alan, who's a professor of meteorology at Rutgers, and a French woman whose husband was working at KAUST. And that was my introduction, if you will, and frankly, very, very limited introduction to Saudi society and Saudi women. And that's the way it is for just about anyone, foreign or not. As in my own college years, the residences were restricted, so that wasn't that much of a surprise. This isn't alcoholic, however, non-alcoholic beer all the way in the Safeway type of store that exists. So these are just some pictures. I went to the beach one day, and here you see, it's not a good picture, women who are dressed in their abayas, who went swimming in their abayas. I thought about, for a brief moment, buying a burkini, as it's called. But I decided, so it's nothing other than really a wetsuit with a long, like a tunic thing, but it was too expensive. We went into Jeddah one day, and here's the wife of the Nobel Prize winner who made a little bit created a little bit of a problem when she decided that she was going to ask the help, most of whom is from South Asia or the Philippines, what their lives were like working for the Saudis. And after she asked about 5, 6, 7 people who were working at the McDonald's or the Burger Kings, because they have all of these things at KAUST, we were asked to take her off of their hands. And so she came with us, and we are walking out on a pier. You saw almost no women when we went, because and if you did, that they were fully covered. Not too surprising. These are men saying evening prayers. We walked in the souk. We even went to a Victoria's Secret. Now, the Saudis have made news within the past year. You know, women now can serve as clerks at Victoria's Secret. When I was there, women couldn't even be clerks, could not be cashiers at the Victoria's Secret. So there is a culture of interest in, certainly the wealth exists, to adopt or to be interested in Western ways, such as, you can see here, this is a bridal shop, and there are strapless gowns in the window. Even though all kinds of socializing is distinctly segregated, at my friend's house, which KAUST pays for, they have a separate living room for the men, and then one upstairs for the women, because lives are led in a very separate fashion there. And even here, can you see that? You read that? It is laser vaginal rejuvenation clinic advertising in Jeddah as we were leaving Jeddah. Because, of course, honor is an important value for many cultures around the world. Maybe it even used to be in the United States, although I don't know about that. But in the larger world of Middle East and South Asia, if one is not a virgin, then you're doomed. And so many people who have wealth come to the big city. Jeddah is also the port of entry for the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. And so there's a huge airport terminal just to process the people that come for those. So you stop along the way and you fix something if you have the money to. And not everyone does, but these are the kinds of dilemmas and dichotomies and my own experiences that certainly have helped me in my teaching. I hope they've been a little bit interesting to you, but lest you think that women are the only ones who have been excluded from the society. Look at this guy. He's a hunk, right? Kicked out of Saudi Arabia a couple weeks ago. He's too pretty for the ladies. Now, again, Saudi Arabia, my husband, I was going through some of the slides, and he was giving me some technical advice on some of them, and he says, Sherry, you're really beating up on the Middle East. And I don't mean to, but in point of fact, not one of the countries in the Middle East or in North Africa, not one of them makes it into any list of countries that have made significant progress or that are good countries for women to live in the OECD or in any kind of government development study, whether it be the United Nations, whether it be for work-life balance, for whatever, for gender equality measures, and these things come out, World Economic Forum, you name it, because of the restrictions that still exist for women. Some of these restrictions are, frankly, not that different from the ones that I have faced when I was born, but that were really kind of quickly dropped away because of the revolutions in the 60s. So here I am, having gone from Saudi Arabia to Jordan, where within moments of getting to our hotel room, I get a knock on the door, and a worker there asks, "Would you like any alcohol?" Knowing that we had come from Saudi Arabia. And so I'm toasting not only to our trip, but the fact that now I can have a drink. Not that I drink that much, but it was an interesting experience, and yet it also underscored the great divide that exists among men and women. So let me move to a Sharbat Gula. Try to remember as much of this because I know I'm running out of time. What time? You want to end at 11:45? Yeah. Okay. So briefly, born, we don't know when, at stage of Soviet, she was born around the time, before the Soviet invasion, 1970, of Afghanistan, 1979. She was 6 years old when her parents were killed, as her brother, who did a bit of the speaking for her when she was interviewed in 2003 when she was found, said, the Soviet Union destroyed our lives. The Russians destroyed our lives. So like so many, about 50 million people in the world today, she became, along with her grandmother and brothers, refugees. They moved to nearby Pakistan, where that picture was taken, in 1985. She then got married at the age of 13. There are millions, I can't remember the exact number, and I'm not going to look at my notes, millions still of child brides, like Shubat, who are married when they're young, who have as many children as possible. She herself had 4 children, no access to, or just the most rudimentary medical facilities existed, health services existed, as you might expect. But here's a kicker. In the 1990s, after the Soviets left, and here she was in this dismal refugee camp near Peshawar, where her husband still works, making $1 a day in a bakery. She returns to her small village near Tora Bora. You probably have heard of that village, right? So she's Pashtun, which is the majority ethnicity there. Her face has been used, as a riveting example of the inequalities that exist for women by virtue of where they are born and by virtue of violence that unfortunately has touched and continues to touch all too many lives, both globally as well as in the United States. Before I forget this, by the way, it's a little bit of a tangent, but Governor Christie last week just signed a Human Trafficking Act. Do you know why? Because the Meadowlands is going to host I think it's still called the Meadowlands, right? Whatever that arena is going to host the 2014 Super Bowl. And and what typically tends to happen, this might be a good future talk, when there's any kind of big sporting event like that, what typically tends to happen is that you have increases in various kinds of sex trafficking, of which 4.4 million women and children are each day, and a lot of internal trafficking as well as just cross-border trafficking. So violence against women or violence didn't escape her, but in a way, so far as we know, it happened through war. She goes back to Tora Bora, where she now has three girls. She had a fourth, but one died in infancy. National Geographic wanted to find her. So they sent someone, and through intermediaries, long and short of it is they found her. She agreed to be portrayed again. She was only photographed twice. These are the two times. She had no idea that her picture had been put on the cover of National Geographic, had no idea that she had become sort of like a symbol or an icon for a movement for the resilience of the Afghan people, this being during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. She had no idea, but what she said was, when she returned to Tora Bora in the 1990s, when the Taliban were in control, that was maybe, she said she really has never had a happy day, but that was maybe one of the happiest times in her life because her life was at least stable. Even though she's living in a village with no school, no running water, and eking out an existence in very marginalized type of agriculture, which is true for most women who live in these marginal areas of the world. And so her life, she's still alive as best we know. It's been 10 years since that picture was taken. They estimate she's now in her late 30s, perhaps. So her daughter is probably her older daughter. The 13-year-old is probably already married. So I use this as an example, even if it's a somewhat extreme example, to get across a couple of things. I'm just going to whisk through these because I'm almost out of time and I want to talk about the Arab Spring, if you don't mind. You need to have access to health measures, and the poorest don't. That's basically what this slide suggests. If you're born in Somalia, your chances of living beyond your first day are 43 times less, should have done that another way, than if you had been born in Finland. The United States ends up, I believe, 68th on that list, again because of the dearth of health care facilities and prenatal facilities that exist in this country. And certainly there needs to be some public policy prescriptions. You have more children, just as Shabbat did. And there are, as I mentioned, child brides, particularly in Africa. Children work. They don't have a carefree life of childhood. They work, and there's also violence. You've probably seen this, maybe you've seen this picture. This woman, Aisha, which appeared on the cover of Time magazine, it says, "What happens if we leave Afghanistan?" And that's what a lot of people are asking in the wake of our departure. Now, this was a couple of years ago. She, because of the court-ordered, Taliban-mandated punishment for her leaving her family, had her nose and ears cut off. They left her for dead. Miraculously, she was found, spirited to a sanctuary near Kabul, and I don't remember now where she presently lives, but I thought you might enjoy this, even though it's not the best graphic resolution. This is what religion did to her. It was religion and culture, I'd say. More this question of honor and dishonor. You don't dare leave the home of your family. You don't dare do that. And science, which has performed a series of reconstructive surgeries on her. So there's a great deal of violence. I'll just use this one slide and then go on to the Arab Spring, I think. 1 in every 3 women is likely to experience some kind of violence sometime in her lifetime. And these are not exclusively women, as we well know, in developing countries, but also right here in the good old USA. Thus, the human trafficking law that was passed. This is too much stuff on this. Education is, of course, important. Early marriage, I've already mentioned, as with Shabbat's case, is something that continues to be prevalent, particularly in these countries here in Bangladesh, in parts of Africa, and no access to contraception, which made a big difference in my life and continues to for many women in developing societies. So the United Nations estimated that women do 2/3 of the world's work. They're not just sitting around eating bonbons, almost in no society these days. Receive 10% of the world's income, 1% of the means of production. So I'm just going to move on. Oh, you might be somewhat interested in this. I'll just answer questions if anybody does have it. Somebody did a calculation about the best states for women. These are the top 5. This is a couple years ago. Connecticut, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, California. Why, would you think? What's so good about those states? Huh? Pay is especially for Connecticut and Massachusetts and Maryland, mentioned that was mentioned. Child care. Even though it can be expensive, they'd say that's one of the problems with Connecticut. And it's frankly one of the problems for almost all of those states. But if you're making enough money, then you can afford to pay for child care. It's people who don't. The 1 in 5 children that go to bed hungry in this society, the 28 to 38% of children worldwide who are stunted or malnourished. They may survive birth, but they don't have the capacity, nor do they have the facilities to learn on a global basis. But much of the same is happening in this country because, as you've probably been hearing, the income gap in this country has widened considerably. By the way, here are the rest of the states. New Jersey ends up in the number 11 spot. One of the reasons it does is because it's one of the 2 countries with paid family leave policy. And I know that many of you may have a negative feeling about John Corzine, but that was one of the things that he did when he was the governor. He, along with the governor of California at the time, which was Arnold Schwarzenegger, enacted that. So, equal pay for equal work has been one of Gloria Steinem's chief ambitions in life. We still have a glass ceiling when it comes to those sorts of things. I'm just going to move on here, as I've said some of this stuff already. As Sheryl Sandberg says, we need to challenge those stereotypes that women have, and we need to start with ourselves. I had to admit to myself, shoot, I've been retired. I was on sabbatical last year. I haven't given a talk in 2 years. Can I still do this? Do I still have the ability to? You may not agree with it, but at least I've gotten through it. And I'm not sure, but you're always doubting. And I don't know how many of you, I know that men probably do too, but I'm always doubting myself. What Sheryl Sandberg says to do is to fake it. And that's what I decided to do. I just fake it, tell a couple of jokes, throw a few facts at you, dazzle you with my spectacular PowerPoints, whatever. But again, she reiterates, you need to lean in, you need to speak up, you need to reignite the revolution inside you, internalize it, and take more risks for yourselves and for your children. And what she argues for men and for families, really. She's not just arguing this for women. And so this set off a huge furor. So he hasn't had it all either. There's my son with my 2 adorable grandchildren and spending a typical weekend day. His wife works at night. She sleeps during the day. He works Monday through Friday. When she sleeps, he's taking care of the kids. It's tough. That's why he likes me out there, and he made that granny cake. But I don't go out there all that often. And the important thing is that we have to understand, and government has to understand, how the nature of work has changed. 80% of the people who work beyond the work day. They bring their work home. It's always there with those snazzy electronic gadgets that everybody has. And so that's good, she says. Make your partner a real partner. She's been divorced before Sandberg was. She married someone who is willing to be her partner. Because the sad fact is, even in the United States of America, as good as many of us have it, women still do most of the housework. And one of her mottos is, done is better than perfect. You don't have to be, but get something done. And also choose someone who's going to be aware of that. Now, Brian, I don't know, he'd rather be surfing much of the time, but he's a really good father. He's had to be. And so while this night-day shift thing is difficult, it's one thing that has forced a change in their own work-life experience. I think for the betterment of the kids, because they really do make good role models. Okay, the Arab Spring. I don't know. Do you want me to just take questions about it? The Arab Spring? Go on? Okay, all right. So, these revolutions that took place throughout North Africa, beginning in Tunisia, December of 2010, moving on to Egypt, to Libya, to Yemen, to Bahrain, as I mentioned, to where now? Syria, all over the place. These revolutions were never, of course, you probably know this, not just about women's rights. But women participated in great numbers in many of these revolutions, particularly in the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolution. And I think I think this quote by this woman is important. We have to understand that these revolutions were largely nonviolent, at least in the beginning, spontaneous, outpourings of frustration by women and men against their leaders, some of whom, like Gaddafi, had been in power since 1969, second only to Fidel Castro in terms of length of power. I know Castro isn't officially in power anymore, but at any rate, he's of that generation. And so the frustrations that were born of that were going to include women. And yet, they also have, as we're now 2 years on into the Arab Spring, the prospect of excluding women from any meaningful changes that are taking place. So we have to be aware of that. As this Gallup poll that was taken, I think it was probably last year, suggests, we're talking about the need for simple dignity. Ordinary people wanting freedom and a better life. You know what those are? Those are secular values. Those are secular values. And right now in the Middle East, you see this interplay of secularism, Islamism, and democracy. Secularism, Islamism, well, I will say that democracy. Playing a role in the kinds of discussions that are taking place. Even the Islamic Muslim Brotherhood's Morsi was elected a year ago. He was not simply put in place, and he doesn't have the power to dismantle some of the other powerful institutions in Egyptian society, for good or for ill. But this is a different kind of animal than the military coups that brought Mubarak from Egypt into power, that brought Gaddafi from Libya into power, that brought some of these autocrats that have ruled for so long into power. And it's wrong, so says one woman commentator, to judge the Arab Spring by the degree to which they are able to suppress the Islamists within their midst. It would be as wrong to do that as to look at, say, the French Revolution or the Iranian Revolution or whatever, any of these other major revolutions that took place in the past, and to argue that, well, they didn't do enough for women, so they don't matter, or they're not important. So that it's important to understand what really took place. And this graph, which might be a little hard for you to see, underscores the role of what some call the other Arab Spring. What Tom Friedman, he's the author of that term, also suggests is the Arab quarter century. Forget spring. Forget spring becoming winter. I mean, they make cutesy little headlines. But the fact of the matter is this is just the beginning of a process, which is another thing that some of the women writers that I've read about the Arab Spring have commented. This is the beginning of a lengthy process that's going to be as messy and perhaps in some cases include violence and in some cases necessitate compromise. But you've got to deal with this pressing reality. And here I come to not just patriarchy, but poverty. These percentages highlight the number of people and the different numbers who are under the age of 30 in these respective societies in North Africa and in the Middle East. 40 to 49%, 50 to 59%, 60 to 69%, and over 70% in this area here, Ethiopia, Djibouti. So we're talking about extraordinary frustration and lack of hope, helplessness on the part of both men and women. People who get educated, maybe, their education rates are not abysmal in most cases, even women in Saudi Arabia, very well educated, but who can't do much after they've graduated. And you might be thinking, well, shoot, isn't that the way it is here? It's increasingly somewhat becoming like that, but on a much, 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 much higher level in these countries. Some of these countries are extraordinarily wealthy, as we know, but some of these countries are not. And so their fertility rates have grown to the extent that they are not able to support their own populations. So that's a reality. The economic strictures and tensions and conflict that are built out of not just gender inequality in this case, but also economic imbalance and patronage. You know, taking care of your buds and forgetting about the rest of the people. So I know you can't see this very well, but this is 1 year ago, well, it's just in November, a chart that highlights the gender equality that has taken place in the 2 years since the Arab Spring. What would you say about that? I don't know how important it is. I can read the names of any of the countries if you're interested.
What's the one on the bottom?
Yemen. Syria is having a decrease, of course, because of the civil conflict there, refugee population there, and the lack of government. I mean, it's a failed state, even though Assad is still in power. But I think you'd have to say, hey, the jury's still out here. 1.2% increase in gender equality, largely because of new constitutions that have been written or in the process of being written. Largely because of that, but hardly because of any other significant change that has yet taken place. Governments are still trying to sort themselves out. I don't know how long the Morsi government in Egypt, for instance, is going to be able to last. It's had a series of challenges. It's still getting large sums of money from the United States and from the other Arab countries that support Egypt. And so we're still seeing some vast disparities. And here is another listing, if you will, of the inequalities that exist in some of these Middle Eastern countries. This is just a selected group, but these are some, of course, that have experienced revolution or are about to. The Saudis just bought off people. They announced a series, and they can do that thanks to the oil that they're still able to send around the world. Any questions about any of these other countries? I know it's a lot to throw at you when y'all been talking for a while too, so I know what that's like. Surprised, maybe there are some people asleep, but it's too dark so I can't see. Yes?
Several
Yes.
right?
No, not just Islamism.
Repeat the question, please.
Yes. Go.
Law favors men in many of these countries. The law is integral to Islam, is it not?
It depends on the country. In Egypt, no. But in Islam, for instance, in terms of inheritance, the Quran does state that a woman should receive half of the share of her brother. She is able to inherit, however. So in a case like Saudi Arabia, that's very much influenced by the religion of Islam, particularly the Wahhabi sect of religion of Islam. But each of these countries has a different both patriarchal or cultural heritage as well as then mixed up with the religion. Just as in many Western societies, the remnants of Judeo-Christian law are still very prominent, and they tended to also provide a preference for men. So it's not exclusively because of Islamic interests in the society or governing it. In fact, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, that was kooky what happened there, Syria, Tunisia, those three countries in particular were much more Western-oriented and had, sort of secular legal systems, either put in place by the British or the French in past colonial times. Now, subsequently today, Morsi is making in Egypt is making an effort to revise the laws and including the Constitution, so that Islamist views of the Muslim Brotherhood, in this case a Sunni Islam sect of Islam, will be more prominent. And he's getting criticized for it. So it's not clear how successful he will be as a leader or how successful he will be in changing that. Because in Gallup polls that have been taken, in Gallup polls, I don't have the question that was asked, but since you mention it, most men in the Middle East say that they think that women should have equal rights. It's less so in Saudi Arabia than in Egypt. I think one thing to keep in mind is in the Middle East, we're talking about a collection of different countries with no cookie cutter template for their political, economic, or religious system. And that is important, but also equally important is the value that Islam does continue to play for women rather, as well as men, as is evidenced in this slide. And I don't have time to show. Now, you've got some radicals on your hands. These women who bare their bodies and write slogans, anti-Islamic slogans, on their bodies to draw attention. They haven't done it. Oh, maybe they have in some of the countries, I think maybe Tunisia, but mostly in Western European countries in front of consulates. But you also have these women. The famous Malala, who recently made Time's 100 most influential people in the world. She's the 15-year-old Pakistani who was speaking out in favor of women's education. The Taliban got on her bus and shot her on the way to school. She was sent to England, where is now recuperating and living. And this young woman, I just heard her story on Brian Lair's show this past week, I believe it is. She and her family have been nominated for the 2013 Nobel Peace Prize. First time a family has been nominated. She works out of Bahrain. She's not in Bahrain right now because she'll be put in jail. But she is now in the Scandinavian country and is working actively for not just women's rights, but for the rights of all those who want to speak out against their government. So, you probably know these conclusions are not startling or dramatic, but these are, if I were the president of the world, let's say, why not? I'll go the president of the United States one better. If you want to try to lean in and speak up, these are the things that I would work on with all of my heart and soul. And maybe I will in some small way, even if I'm not president of the world. You need education, and you need to invest in it. And that's why I say public policy in the United States needs to be more family-friendly. It's going to help both men and women. And we need to change. And we need to put the investment, and we don't need to take away money and probably many of you agree, maybe you don't, but this is my prescription. Because throughout my course of teaching, years of teaching, I've seen the value of education in my own students. 2 of them even showed up here today. I don't know if they knew I was speaking, but in any event, it's important, and it's vitally important for women to be educated in countries that are poor. You need more women leaders. You need support for programs that are going to enhance women's rights, particularly education, and I'll tell you 2 that I've involved in. And you need to reduce poverty. It would help us, and it would help them. And the best way I know of to do that, that would jumpstart our own economy, as well as economies around the world, is to utilize the new technologies that we have, but also to get off of our addiction to oil. And that goes with internal addiction, or at least the internal pending developments of fracking, which I do not agree with. We need to move beyond oil, and it's going to be wrenching for many of us, including my husband, who's trying to design his next car. Should he get a Porsche or not? I'm so tired of hearing about it. I think, for heaven's sakes. But he has a Prius, so it's tough for him. But you need to move beyond these addictions that have led us to some very, very poor choices vis-a-vis other countries of the world. So what do? One of the things I've done, along with Kathy Yelly, who's sitting in the back there, my good friend and colleague at Brookdale, is to join Dining for Women. There's a local group. If you're interested, get in touch with me at that email. The second Tuesday of each month, we all make a dish. We take it to somebody's house. We sit and gab and drink. I'll drink to that again. And we donate whatever we think we can afford in lieu of going out to dinner. And we raise money for specific programs that are chosen by the national organization Dining for Women. In this case, it is Afghan women speak to the world with their embroidery. So they have to, the organizations, international organizations have to submit proposals. Dining for Women board funds them. We help raise money for them. It's pretty easy, almost a painless way to try to help bring opportunity to people in other parts of the world. For several years now, I have supported Women for Women International, which grew out of the, I think, the Iraqi war situation, as well as the problems in Rwanda. And so by now, I think I've sponsored 3 or 4 women who are, this one, my most recent one, which I just received a letter from her, is from Rwanda. And this is what she wrote to me. I'll see if I can read this. Let me see. So I wish you God's peace. I thank you for your sponsorship funds because it helped me to achieve something, getting out of poverty, and I have learned even more. I know how to have money and I have learned how to start a small business. Because of your sponsorship funds, I bought a domestic animal. Thank you. So, it's nice to be able to be able to change a lot of people's lives. It's also nice to change a few at a time. So I would recommend that. And I also prepared a resource sheet. If you want to read more about these issues, or if you want to get involved in a variety of issues, there are a number of organizations, both locally, because I realize I haven't spoken too much about that, or in the United States, as well as internationally. All right, that's it. I guess I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Red Bank Humanists podcast. For more information, visit redbankhumanists.org or follow us on Twitter @RedBankHumanists.